The farmhouse stands as a lonely, defiant sentinel against the vast, encroaching darkness of the valley. To an outsider, it is merely a structure of wood, mud, and ambition. A project of a man named Jack who turned his back on the sterile, glass and steel towers of the city to plant his feet in the unforgiving soil. But to the inhabitants, Jack, his wife, Tu Tien, and the matriarch of the family, it is an altar. It is where they have laid down their pasts, their deep-seated regrets, and their flickering ambitions, hoping to build an impenetrable fortress against the chaos of the world. Tonight, however, the fortress is hollow. The air is thick with the scent of ozone, damp moss, and the sharper, metallic tang of an approaching storm. The sky is a bruised purple, pressing down on the ridgeline like a heavy shroud. Jack returns from the construction site, his boots heavy with the clay of a long, grueling day. His hands are raw, the skin calloused and split from wrestling with rebar and concrete. He carries the weight of the new house on his shoulders, a structure he vowed would provide safety, warmth, and a legacy. He walks toward the porch, expecting the simple, grounding rhythm of home, the familiar smell of dinner, the soft laughter of his wife, and the quiet, comforting presence of his mother. He does not know that the foundation he poured with such precision is being tested by forces far more volatile than the wind or the rain. He does not know that the house he built to keep the world out has become the very stage for his own undoing. The morning had begun with a fragile, deceptive calm. Jack and Tu Tien stood by the old gate, their voices weaving through the morning mist. The conversation was practical, rooted in the hard reality of their survival, yet underlined with a frantic, protective instinct. Ly, the young woman they had rescued from the brink of total annihilation, was the ghost in the machine of their quiet lives. Her pregnancy, her hollowed-out eyes, and the shadow of the violence she carried with her had become their moral compass. They were determined to shield her, to offer her a sanctuary in the shed at the bottom of the hill, believing that kindness was the ultimate armor. "The shed is sturdy enough for now," Jack had said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "It's a roof, Tu Tien. It's better than the mud of the road. We can reinforce the walls tomorrow." Tu Tien had looked at him, her gaze lingering on the distant, swaying trees. She knew the cost of kindness. She knew that every favor extended to the broken was a debt written in potential blood. "I'll watch over her, Jack. I'll make sure she has everything she needs until her family comes for her. We can't just leave her to the elements." They were noble, they were kind, and in the harsh reality of their world, they were dangerously naive. They did not see the movement in the tree line. They did not hear the calculated, deliberate snap of dry brush near the perimeter of the bamboo fence. They were blinded by the light of their own integrity, mistaking the silence of the forest for peace, rather than the held, predatory breath of a hunter waiting for the light to fade. As Jack departed for the city, the farm settled into a state of suspended animation. Tu Tien moved through her chores with a rigid, almost mechanical efficiency. She harvested what was left of the winter squash, her hands steady, but her ears were straining against the quiet. The dogs, usually indifferent to the passing hours, were prowling the perimeter, their fur bristling, their low, rhythmic growls vibrating in the stillness. Something had shifted in the ecosystem of their home. The air felt thin, electric. Then the phone rang, shattering the delicate equilibrium. Mr. Dung, a man whose life had been inextricably linked to the trials of the family, spoke with an urgency that left no room for pleasantries. He wasn't just checking in, he was moving. He was bringing the mother, bringing the past, and bringing a trail of connections that led straight back to the village that had once tried to destroy them. It was a call from a life they had fought to bury. The arrival was a spectacle of bittersweet nostalgia. The yard was suddenly filled with the clatter of supplies, the mewling of a kitten gifted to Tu Tien, and the chaotic joy of puppies tumbling over one another in the dirt. It was a temporary fortress of warmth, a domestic celebration designed to ward off the encroaching night. Jack's mother, weary from the road, looked at the half-finished house and saw not just wood and stone, but the resurrection of a son she thought she had lost to the cruelty of the city. She saw his hands, rough and scarred, and she saw the man he had become. But while the adults spoke of harvests and foundations, Ly was coming undone. She stood in the center of the shed, a silhouette against the rising darkness. She had seen him, Thon, the man who had haunted her, the man who smelled of stale tobacco and impending ruin. He wasn't a stranger, he was the architect of her nightmare, and he had found them. He was out there, a shadow in the vegetable garden, his eyes fixed on the house that was meant to be her shelter. He wasn't looking for a fight, he was looking for a harvest. Tu Tien stepped into the shed, her face softened by a misplaced, motherly pity. Ly, come inside, eat something. You look like you've seen a ghost. Ly turned, and for a heartbeat, the mask of the victim vanished. Her eyes were sharp, calculated, and raw with a terror so deep it bordered on insanity. She knew that her presence here was a death sentence. She knew that every plate of food she accepted was an invitation for Than to strike. I have people, Ly whispered, her voice a fragile, brittle thing. They're coming, I can't stay, Tu Tien. If I stay, I'll be the one to burn your home to the ground. Tu Tien refused to let the darkness take root. She reached out, pressing a basket of food into Ly's hands, trying to anchor her with the gravity of her own goodness. She didn't realize that in her generosity, she was arming the future. When Ly reached for the rust-streaked knife, an old tool left by the door, Tu Tien handed it to her, a moment of silent, fateful complicity. It was a decision made in love, but it carried the weight of a weapon. As the sun bled out behind the jagged teeth of the mountains, the farm grew cold. Jack returned, his body exhausted, his mind a fortress of blueprints and load-bearing walls. He stepped into the kitchen, his mother's presence a soothing balm for his frayed, jagged nerves. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed that if he worked hard enough, he could build a wall against destiny. The new house, Jack told his mother, his voice resonant, echoing against the unfinished walls. That's where we start over. The old place, the one where we suffered, we leave it behind. We build from the ground up, and we make it unbreakable. The mother listened, her heart aching for the boy who thought he could outrun his own history. She saw the abundance, the tools, the life they had woven a tapestry of hope, and she felt the icy draft of the night air whistling through the gaps in the boards. She knew that no wall was thick enough to stop the rot of the past if it had already taken root in the soil. In the shadows, the reality was starkly different. Thon moved through the tall, unkempt grass, his feet making no sound, his body a dark smear against the landscape. He wasn't looking for the shed, he was looking for the throat of the house. He had watched Ly depart, clutching her basket, and he knew exactly what she was carrying. He had mapped the house's weak points, he had timed the patrols of the dogs, he had watched the CEO work, and he had seen the weakness in the man's pride. He didn't want the land, he wanted the only thing that would shatter the pride of the man who had dared to defy him. He wanted the silence that follows an ending. He waited until the lights in the kitchen dimmed. He waited until the voices of the family faded into the rhythmic, lullaby hum of the night crickets. Inside the house, Tu Tien was clearing the table, the warmth of the hearth still clinging to her skin. She didn't hear the subtle shift in the air pressure, the way the wind changed direction as it hit the porch. She didn't see the shape pressed against the exterior wall, his hand resting on the splintered wood, watching her through the gap in the window frame. Jack stepped onto the porch for a final, solitary check of his tools. He stopped, his hand resting on the heavy, hand-carved post of the gate. He froze. A sound, not the wind, not the crickets. not the settling of the foundation, the distinct, metallic rasp of a blade against stone. He turned, his eyes scanning the absolute darkness of the yard, his survival instinct igniting in the base of his skull. He was no longer the builder, he was the hunter. He didn't speak. He didn't call out a warning that would tip his hand. He knew that in the silence, the predator was waiting for a mistake. The distance between the front door and the tree line was only 20 paces, but it felt like a gulf of war. Jack looked back at the kitchen window at Tu Tien, moving in the soft, golden light, completely unaware of the blade being sharpened in the dark. He looked at the empty shed, a dark, hollow reminder of the girl they had failed to protect. He took a step forward, his shadow stretching across the yard, long and distorted. The forest groaned under the weight of the wind, a low, guttural roar that swallowed the sounds of the farm. The threat was no longer an abstraction. It was standing at the threshold of their lives. Van stepped out of the cover of the ancient trees. He held a length of wire in his hand, coiled tight, his eyes fixed on the back of Jack's neck. He didn't want the land. He didn't want the crops. He wanted the only thing that would shatter the pride of the man who had dared to defy him. He wanted the silence that follows an ending. Jack stopped. He felt the shift in the air, the cold suction of the killer's intent. He felt the weight of a gaze that was not his own. The final confrontation of the night was silent. There were no grand declarations, no cinematic monologues. There was only the sound of Jack's heartbeat hammering against his ribs and the cold, unyielding stare of the man who had come to tear it all down. Behind the glass of the window, Tu Tien paused, a dish towel in her hand, staring into the impenetrable blackness. She saw nothing but the trees, but she felt a sudden, sickening drop in the temperature of the room. She dropped the towel. It landed on the floor with a soft, muffled sound, a signal that the sanctuary had been breached. The stage is set. The house, intended to be a bastion of safety, has become a lethal trap. Every piece of equipment, every scrap of food, every ounce of trust they extended to the world has been meticulously turned against them. As the wind begins to whip the trees into a frenzy, the farmhouse windows rattle in their frames like teeth. The light in the kitchen flickers, then holds. Jack stands in the yard, his hands empty, his life exposed, facing the man who has spent the entire day carving a path through the wilderness just to destroy him. The cycle of the farm is broken. There is no tomorrow to harvest. There is only the immediate, violent necessity of the present. As the darkness closes in, the truth becomes clear. They aren't just building a home. They are defending their right to exist in a world that demands they be broken. The final frame captures the reflection of the house in Jack's eyes, the light of the kitchen, the safety of his mother, the presence of his wife, and then, in the corner of the screen, the glint of the wire in the predator's hand catches the moonlight. The silence breaks. The motion begins. The farmhouse becomes a battlefield, and the history of their struggle is rewritten in a single, breathless moment of violence. The foundation has been laid, the walls have been raised, but now, the family will see if they can survive the storm that they themselves invited across the threshold. This moment is the culmination of every choice Jack and Tu Tien have ever made. Every act of charity, every moment of vulnerability, every brick they laid, it all leads here. The predator is not just hunting a girl, he is hunting the very idea of their happiness. He is the manifestation of every shadow they tried to outrun, the physical embodiment of the past that refused to stay buried. And as the clouds break, revealing a sliver of pale, unforgiving moonlight, we see the true nature of their predicament. They are not merely fighting for property. They are fighting for the right to define their own worth in a world that has only ever treated them as obstacles. The wire tightens. Jack shifts his weight. The dogs let out a low, desperate whine. The storm has not just arrived, it has moved inside. And in the heart of that storm, in the shadow of the house that Jack built, the family must decide, for the very last time, what they are willing to burn to keep the light alive. The tension pulls taut, a wire snapping in the dark, and the screen cuts to black before the first blow lands. We are left with the echo of the wind and the certainty that tomorrow will look nothing like today. The farmhouse will never be the same. The people inside will never be the same, and the legacy of Jack and Tu Tien will either be built in stone or etched in blood, but it will be theirs, and theirs alone, to claim or to lose forever. The nightmare they feared has finally shed its disguise. The hunt is over. The reckoning has arrived. They have built their home on the edge of the world, and now they must pay the price of admission.